Jane Britton was born on May 17, 1945, in Boston, Massachusetts. Her father worked as a vice president of Radcliffe College in Cambridge, while her mother was a scholar specializing in medieval history. Therefore, it was no surprise that from an early age, Jane developed a strong fascination with history, and by the time she reached high school, she had already made up her mind that she wanted to study anthropology. She was an excellent student with straight A's, played the piano, loved painting, and spent her spare time horseback riding. After graduating at the very top of her class, she enrolled in her father's college and quickly distinguished herself as one of its most outstanding students. In time, her dedication paid off. She was admitted into Harvard's anthropology graduate program, where she began working toward her PhD. During her second year, she was given the opportunity to join an archaeological excavation in Iran under the supervision of a respected scholar. She left a strong impression and even contributed several notable discoveries. Beyond academics, Jane was well liked by her peers, and she had recently begun dating a fellow student named James. On January 7, 1969, Jane was scheduled to take her final exams. She was 23 years old at the time and eagerly looking forward to finally completing school and starting her career. But that morning, she never appeared. Her boyfriend James found it strange. He tried calling her multiple times before the exam, but she did not answer. Nobody else, either classmates nor professors, had any idea why she was absent. So after class, James chose to walk over to her apartment, located about 15 minutes away from campus. When he arrived on her floor, he knocked, but no one responded. A fellow student and mutual friend named Donald, who lived in the next apartment, came out after hearing the knocking. He mentioned that he had not seen Jane since the previous night, and her apartment had remained quiet ever since. James knocked a few more times, but still there was no reply. That was when he began to grow worried. He knew that Jane's front door lock was practically broken, so he turned the handle, and the door opened. Inside the apartment, everything appeared normal, aside from one detail. It was bitterly cold. When James walked into the kitchen, he noticed the window standing wide open, despite it being the middle of winter. Then he stepped into Jane's bedroom and saw her lying face down on the bed. Her nightgown had ridden up, so he immediately backed out and asked Donald's wife to check if Jane was all right. James thought perhaps she was only sick or asleep. But when Donald's wife came out of the room, the expression on her face said everything. She could not even speak. James went back into the bedroom, and that was when he saw it. Jane's face was covered with both a rug and a coat. When he lifted them, he realized she was dead. He called the police at once, and with just one glance officers knew they were looking at a homicide. The body was handed over to the medical examiner, and detectives began processing the apartment. One of the first observations was that nothing appeared to have been taken. Jane's jewelry, money, and other valuables were still untouched, which ruled out robbery as a possible motive. There were also no signs of a struggle, leading investigators to think the attacker may have caught her off guard, likely while she was asleep. That theory was reinforced by the fact that none of Jane's neighbors recalled hearing anything unusual. The autopsy showed that Jane had been struck repeatedly in the head with a heavy object, probably a hammer or a rock. It was also confirmed that she had been sexually assaulted. After speaking with Jane's boyfriend, police learned that the previous night, the two of them had gone out to dinner with several other students and afterward went ice skating. James said he walked her home afterward and left around 11:30 p.m. Donald and his wife told investigators that about an hour later, Jane had stopped by their apartment for a quick glass of cherry wine. And that was the last time anyone saw her alive. According to the medical examiner, she had likely been killed about 10 hours before her body was discovered, meaning the attack must have taken place shortly after she returned to her own apartment. The apartment itself did not offer detectives much to work with. Crime scene technicians found a few fingerprints that did not belong to Jane's friends or neighbors, but none matched anyone in their records. As for how the killer got inside, police had two theories. For one, Jane's front door lock had not been functioning for some time, so someone might have simply walked in. But there was also another possibility. Jane's window locks were just as unreliable as her door, and even though she lived on the 4th floor, a fire escape ran directly outside her apartment, which meant anyone could have climbed up and slipped through the window. That theory gained traction after detectives questioned residents in the building and found a child who remembered hearing noises on the fire escape that night. But there was an issue. He said the sounds occurred around 9 p.m., yet Jane did not get home with her boyfriend until nearly 11:30. Another witness later came forward claiming he had seen a man running away from the building at about 1:30 in the morning. He did not get a clear look at him, only recalled that the man was around 6 feet tall with an average build. That account seemed somewhat more promising since the timing aligned with the estimated window of the murder. But without additional details, police could not do much with it. Still, based on both witness statements, detectives began to suspect that the killer might have climbed onto the fire escape around 9 p.m., then waited there for hours until Jane returned. Donald also told investigators something noteworthy. Earlier that evening, before Jane came home, he had gone into her apartment to use her refrigerator, where he and his wife stored some of their groceries. He said everything had looked normal at that time, which meant either the intruder had not entered yet or was waiting outside on the fire escape. It was also possible that the first witness had simply been mistaken about the timing. Even so, detectives could not rule out another scenario. Perhaps none of those events had anything to do with the murder at all. They learned that residents in the building often left their windows open during winter because the heating system was excessively strong. By the following morning, news of Jane's murder had spread across the university, and it was not long before the case made national headlines. Police came under tremendous pressure. Students at one of the nation's most prestigious universities were frightened to remain on campus while the killer was still free. And soon, a new theory began to take shape. What if the perpetrator was another Harvard student? There was a rather unusual reason behind that suspicion. Investigators had discovered a reddish powder on Jane's body and in her room, something resembling ochre or iron oxide. A professor explained that in some ancient cultures, particularly in regions like Iran, where Jane had recently traveled, it was a tradition to sprinkle such powder over the dead. That sparked speculation that the killer might have been another anthropology student, someone who not only possessed that knowledge but may even have traveled to Iran with Jane. Supporting this idea was the fact that nothing in her apartment had been taken, not even money, suggesting the motive was personal. Police were not entirely convinced by the theory, but they could not dismiss it either. Detectives compiled a list of roughly 100 students and faculty members with anthropological backgrounds and investigated each one. But it led nowhere. Later, another theory emerged. What if Jane had been the victim of a serial offender? 5 years earlier, another female student had been killed in the very same building, only 2 floors below Jane's apartment. At that time, detectives suspected the infamous Boston Strangler might have been responsible, and he even confessed to the crime. But many people had doubts. Some believed he had falsely confessed, which is not uncommon in high-profile cases. And in any case, by the time Jane was murdered, the Boston Strangler was already confined in a secure psychiatric facility. So either way, he could not have been involved. While detectives still lacked solid leads, local newspapers were busy fueling theories and pointing fingers at the university. Harvard had purchased the building a few years earlier and had started housing students there, but the place was in poor condition. Most of the apartment locks were broken or jammed, and the windows were just as faulty. Residents said they could be forced open from the outside with little effort. Because of that, newspapers began criticizing the university for allowing students to live in such unsafe housing. Meanwhile, police kept searching for anything useful. They administered polygraph tests to Jane's boyfriend and her neighbors, questioned several other possible suspects, and even set up cameras at her funeral to record everyone who attended. Detectives identified each person there, but none could be connected to the crime. Weeks went by, and they were no closer to finding the killer. That was how things remained until February 6th. Nearly 1 month after Jane's death, police found the body of a 50-year-old woman named Ada Ben. She was discovered in her apartment only about a mile from Jane's. Ada was lying face down in bed, her nightgown pulled up, and her head covered with several blankets. Just like Jane, she had been bludgeoned in the head with a heavy object, and it appeared she too had been attacked while asleep. Local media immediately highlighted the striking similarities between the cases. But for reasons unclear, police rejected the idea. They announced that they saw no connection between the two murders and did not believe they were dealing with the same offender. That statement was met with predictable skepticism. Most students and locals were convinced that a serial predator was at large and could strike again at any time. Yet, just as in Jane's case, investigators uncovered no solid leads, and the second murder investigation soon went cold as well. There were no new developments in Jane's case, and eventually it was shelved. Over the years, detectives revisited the file periodically, but each effort led nowhere. At one point, the local police department transferred the case to the state police, who launched their own investigation, but again they came up empty-handed. In the late 1980s, when DNA analysis began to be widely used in forensics, detectives decided to re-examine the physical evidence. That was when they found samples collected from Jane's body. The lab was able to isolate a faint trace of semen, likely from the perpetrator, but it was not sufficient to build a full DNA profile. Years later, when the FBI's National DNA Database became operational, analysts searched for a match, but none was found. In 2006, they tried again using more advanced technology, hoping for a breakthrough. But once more, they hit a dead end. The case remained cold for several more years until a group of amateur sleuths took an interest. One was a retired writer who had been a young reporter at the time of Jane's murder. In fact, it had been only his second day on the job when he was assigned to cover the case. Decades later, he decided to revisit it, determined to finally uncover the truth and write a book about what had really happened. Another was a journalist from Harvard. When she learned about Jane's killing so close to her own campus, she became deeply invested and committed herself to help solve it. They were joined by a forum moderator who ran a site dedicated to unsolved crimes, and she too was determined to get to the bottom of the mystery. They began digging into Jane's case and filed numerous records requests with police, but nearly all were denied. The few documents they received were mostly old newspaper clippings containing only surface-level details. At that time, such secrecy was common practice in Massachusetts, even though police departments in other states were much more open with cold case files. But the group refused to give up. They took their fight to an appeals court, arguing that greater transparency had already helped solve other decades-old crimes by drawing in more people and generating new leads. The court denied their petition, but even that did not stop them. Over the next several years, they continued filing lawsuits against the district attorney's office. One by one, each suit was dismissed, but all that pressure still had an effect. After years of reminders about the case, authorities finally agreed to reopen it in 2017. Experts re-examined the biological evidence from the scene, and this time they succeeded in extracting a somewhat stable DNA sample. When they ran it through the FBI's database, they found a potential match, a man named Michael Sumter. The difficulty was that the match was only partial, which would not hold up in court, and the sample was too weak to create a full profile. Still, detectives began digging into Sumter, hoping to find something conclusive. He already had a record for 3 separate sexual assaults, which was why his DNA was in the system in the first place. Then, in 2010 and 2012, police solved 2 other cold case murders from the 1970s after linking old DNA samples to Sumter's profile. All of his known crimes occurred in Boston, close to Harvard. Investigators also learned that around the time of Jane's murder, he was dating a woman who lived near the university. On top of that, he matched the description of the man seen running from Jane's building, both in height and build. Everything pointed to Sumter as the likely suspect, but there was one major obstacle. He had died of cancer back in 2001, which meant they could not obtain a direct DNA sample from him. Nevertheless, detectives pressed on. Instead of trying to test Sumter himself, they searched for a close male relative and eventually learned he had a brother who was still alive. It took time to track him down, but once they did, he agreed to provide a DNA sample. The results came back as a match, though not entirely perfect. Once again, the problem lay with the degraded sample from the crime scene. It was not enough to build a complete genetic profile. Even so, the test was conclusive enough to exclude all but 0.08% of the global male population. That might still be nearly 350,000 men, but given that Sumter lived near the crime scene and had a history of similar assaults, it was more than enough to point to him as the killer. In 2018, 49 years after Jane's murder, police held a press conference and officially announced that the case had been solved. They believed that on the night of the crime, Michael Sumter had followed Jane home and waited until her boyfriend left. Then he climbed the fire escape, entered through the kitchen window, and attacked her with the intent to assault. As for why the DNA match had not been made until 2017, detectives offered a straightforward explanation. Sumter's DNA had been in the system for years, but the sample from Jane's case was so degraded that older technology could not produce a strong enough profile to even get a partial match. It was only thanks to newer, more sensitive equipment that the connection was finally made. In the two other murder cases linked to Sumter, full DNA profiles had been available, making those identifications easier to confirm. Police were never able to connect him to the murder of the second woman found a month later. The issue was that no usable DNA had been recovered from that scene, so detectives could not say with certainty. But given the disturbing similarities between the two crimes, many believe Sumter was responsible for that one as well. As for the reddish powder discovered in Jane's room and on her body, something that had fueled theories about ancient burial rituals, police concluded it was most likely just pigment from the paint she used in her artwork. There was no evidence it had anything to do with the murder itself. In the end, Jane's case was finally closed, even if it had taken nearly 5 decades. And much of that was thanks to the small group of citizens who refused to let her story fade away and pushed the police to reopen the investigation. If you found this case intriguing, make sure to like and subscribe. We upload new crime case videos every night. Stay tuned and brace yourself for what's coming next.